Greetings friends, my name is Pavel Stelmach and I'm glad to present for you the new episode of our daily wrap-up series. Kenya, Yemen and Sudan, ships with wheat, which we are currently preparing as part of the Grain from Ukraine initiative, will be sent to these three countries. Now we are preparing ships, said Deputy Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food, Markian Dmitrasevich. In total, up to 30,000 tons of grain will leave our ports. Before that, we sent the same amount to wheat to Ethiopia. In total, 110,000 tons of wheat have already been sent to countries in need of food. And this despite the fact that most Ukrainian ports are currently blocked, and all ships going to and from Ukraine are inspected by the Russians. At the same time, inspections last several weeks, not days. You ask why? So I don't know either. But while the Russians do not allow the movement of ships with grain, their foreign minister went to African countries and says that the global crisis is due to the behavior of the global West.
President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly pointed out that the West is using the same colonial methods it used before to exploit the developing continents and continues to use them in order to plunder other countries and to use resources of global importance for its own gain. The West's actions prove that it can trample over the values and the globalization mechanism that is created and promoted, including inviolability of property, fair competition, or the presumption of innocence at any time, and can betray its allies at any time as well. Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Minister of Russian Federation, in comment for the media in Angola.
Only you know what I will tell you. It is Russia, not the West, that uses the captured territories for its own purposes. It is Russia, not the West, that violates the approved mechanisms, in particular the laurel named inviolability of property, fair competition, or the presumption of innocence. After all, it is the Russian military that is destroying cities and buildings in Ukraine one by one. It was the Russian military who sent home household appliances, clothes and even toilets stolen from Ukrainian homes. It was Russia that denounced all international agreements on the rule of law, decided that it would no longer recognize the decision of the European Court for Human Rights. It is the Russian military that hides behind civilians, takes off its chevrons and hides in its own country to avoid punishment. In particular, for example, in the case of MH17, these are the Russians who violated international agreements by annexing Crimea and part of Donbass, and now they are trying to seize all of Ukraine. And only our unwillingness to live with crazy nation in the same country stopped the spread of the Russian tumor further. And by the word further, I do not mean only Europe, because Russia is trying to capture also the Caucasus and the Kuril Islands. And there have already been talks about the fact that Kazakhstan was also formed only thanks to the USSR and accordingly the Russians. And it was Russia that exported 500,000 tons of wheat from the ports of Crimea, which they simply stole from the occupied territories of Ukraine's south. And now they are trying to show that they are worried about the food security of the whole world, and Africa in particular. Unlock the operation of the port in the Mykolaiv region in order to expand the export of grain.
Due to the war against Ukraine and Russia's blocking of our ports, African countries that suffer the most from the problems of rising food prices and food shortages. We would like to clarify once again what exactly is the cause of the problems, namely the full-scale war started by Russia against Ukraine. Markian Dmitrasevich, Deputy Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food of Ukraine, in an interview with Suspilne Uzhhorod.
Let me remind you that it was the president of Ukraine who initiated the Grain from Ukraine program, and this initiative is proven to be a great success. To date, more than 30 countries have joined the humanitarian program, which has accumulated nearly $200 million in donations. Ukraine's goal is to provide at least 5 million people with grain by the end of spring this year. Ukraine is committed to fulfilling its obligations and is continuing to ship agricultural products to ensure global food security and price stability. The initiative looks to expand even further, with international experts contributing to its implementation. As part of a new African strategy, Ukraine is aiming to open 10 new embassies across the continent and expand its diplomatic relations with dozens of African states in 2023. 17.5 million tons of Ukrainian food has already been shipped to the most vulnerable countries in the global south as part of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The aggressor state continues to spread chaos and instability by threatening the region with the growing influence of the Wagner Group mercenaries and by denying their role in causing the global food crisis. It is essential that food stability and global security be restored, and all African countries are asked to demand Russia's compliance with signed agreements and commitments, as well as non-interference in the internal affairs of countries of the Global South.
Global growth and international stability in the century cannot be imagined without relation with Africa and other parts of the Global South. Latin America, India, other Asian countries, including China and Southern Asia. The entire region of the island of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Ukraine must find the format of its leadership in strategic processes in each of these regions.
And you know, even in this, we Ukrainians work together with our partners. And we are thankful that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz travels to Chile to meet with President Gabriel Boric. NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg holds a meeting with South Korea's Foreign Minister Park Jin in Seoul. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrives in Egypt, beginning a 3-day visit to the Middle East. Ukraine is calling on the countries of the world to respond firmly to Russia's aggressive policy in Africa. But you know, the Russians do not pursue an aggressive policy everywhere. For example, in sports, Russian athletes are quieter than water, but they still promote their imperial narratives. You have probably heard the phrase "sport outside of politics" more than once. But in reality it is not so, because then why are the countries that want to improve world perception trying to hold the major sport competitions? Why did the USSR and the USA boycott the Olympics held in another country in the 80s? Why we are now hearing again that Russians and Belarusians can be allowed to compete under a neutral flag and with a neutral attitude to the war? Will you be surprised when Russian athletes will talk about the fact that they are not involved in the actions of the Russian army? But I will reveal a secret to you. The majority of Russian athletes are officers of one or another power structure: the army, border guards, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and their presence in the Olympic Games is the participation of representatives of the attacking army. Don't they just write reports in order to take part in competitions? And I will not be surprised that they will do so, but will not say anything about the war. After all, they are neutral athletes under a neutral flag.
Не буває нейтральності, коли триває така війна.
There is no such thing as neutrality when a war like this is going on, and we know how often tyrannies try to use sports for their ideological interests. It is obvious that any neutral flag of Russian athletes is stained with blood. We will do everything so that the world will protect sports from politicians and any other influence of the terrorist state, which is simply inevitable if Russian athletes participate in competition, and especially at the Paris Olympics.
Thus, the International Olympic Committee noted that there will be special criteria for the participation of Russian and Belarusian athletes. No flag, anthem, colors, or any other identifications whatsoever of these countries being displayed at any sports event or meeting, including the entire venue. And if one of the athletes will show the Russian flag or the letter Z, or shows his militant nature in some other way, then what? We will take away the medal? I do not believe in that. After all, don't take away a medal for impulsive behavior, and if the spectator carries the flag. So, because all risks cannot be taken into account, therefore it is necessary to prevent participants from entering the competition. This is the only correct solution. It was possible to disqualify athletes from Yugoslavia, but not Russians and Belarusians. Yes, the IOC itself writes that in 1992 there were United Nations sanctions in place against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and there are no such sanctions against Russia. Do you know why? Because Russia vetoes all UN decisions regarding their aggression, and will continue to do so, just because it can. I also want to remind you of the main years when Russia attacked its neighbors. Georgia 2008, a few days before the opening of the Olympic Games in Beijing. Annexation of Crimea 2014, a few days after the end of the Olympics in Sochi. A full-scale attack on Ukraine in 2022, a few days after the end of the Olympics in Beijing.
Это еще старый принцип, еще древних Олимпийских игр.
The old principle of the ancient Olympic Games. When the Olympic Games were to be held, the wars had to stop. And Putin went to war in the Olympic years. And now the leadership of the International Olympic Committee should turn to Putin to stop this war and withdraw Russian troops from Ukraine.
It was not for nothing that Volodymyr Zelensky wrote a letter to French President Emmanuel Macron, because after all, the Games will be held in Paris, and it is the local authorities who can decide what to do with the athletes from the aggressor countries. After all, Great Britain did not want and did not let the Russians into Wimbledon, so why should we let other aggressors into Paris? Attempts by the International Olympic Committee to return Russian athletes to competitions and the Olympic Games are an attempt to tell the world that terror can be acceptable, as if it is possible to turn a blind eye to what Russia is doing with Kherson, with Kharkiv and Bakhmut, and with Avdiivka. And finally, I would like to tell you a little about Ukrainian history, in particular about the events that took place 105 years ago. After the revolution in Tsarist Russia and the removal of Nicholas II, several independent countries emerged on the territory of the Russian Empire. Among them is the independent Ukrainian People's Republic. However, of course, the Moscow leaders did not like this and went to war on Kyiv. Yes, we have already experienced what is happening now. And it was precisely in January 1918 that the communists wanted to capture Kyiv. They used the same tactics, a column along the roads, that time railway, which should have simply entered the capital of another country. However, in 1918, the Russians did not succeed, because Ukrainian fighters came out to meet them and gave battle near Kruty. It is 130 kilometers from Kyiv. On the morning of January the 29th, 1918, the attack on the Ukrainian position of the 4,000-strong Bolshevik detachment of Petrograd and Moscow Red Guards began. The Ukrainian army, which was destined to engage in bloody battle with this horde, numbered about 400 Ukrainians. That is, there were 10 times more Russians. But our soldiers stood for 4 days, after which they retreated, but did not lose.
The death in battle of about 100 Ukrainian soldiers is a tragedy, but 3 times the number of enemy losses denies the thesis of defeat, especially if you take into account that the ratio of the forces of the combatants was almost 1 to 10, not in favor of the Ukrainians. The Bolsheviks managed to continue their offensive on Kyiv only 4 days later. For the independent Ukrainian People's Republic, which were declared only a few days ago, these were decisive 4 days that allowed it to receive international recognition and military aid. Soon after that, the Bolsheviks were driven further east. Yes, a year later they returned again, but again, not forever. Volodymyr Petrovich, historian, PM of Ukraine.
So we fought the Russians even then and fought successfully. After all our troops performed the combat task, they stopped the offense. Having completed the task, the Ukrainian forces left the station in an organized manner, taking the wounded, weapons and blowing up the track behind them. Kruty was defended by a mixed personnel. This is an important parallel to modern times, when both regular units of the defense forces and various volunteers took up arms in February. People acted according to the orders of senior officers and officers, that is, professional soldiers. Even then, we showed that our officers are among the best in the world. And you also know that the war of 1918 has many other parallels with modern times. The Russians tried to advance along the railway tracks, an echelon war. In 2022, the Russians tried to advance in columns along the tracks. The directions of the blows in 1918 and in 2022 were almost identical, and that is why we understand that if the Russians withdraw now and do not lose, they will attack again with larger forces, and therefore they must be stopped, forced to cross the state borders, and most importantly, prevent another attack. That concludes our today's video. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for future videos. Subscribe to UATV English and goodbye.